Harold Foster's weathered hands trembled as he held the unfamiliar bottle of lubricant found behind Margaret's toiletries. 35 years of marriage collapsed in that moment, their bedroom's familiar scent now tainted with suspicion. Afternoon light filtered through curtains they'd chosen together, casting shadows across the wedding photo on his nightstand. His reflection in the dresser mirror showed a man he barely recognized, eyes reining as the first tears formed. Have you ever discovered a betrayal that shattered decades of trust? Share your experience below, like if Harold's pain resonates with you, and follow to witness how wisdom can triumph over heartbreak. The grandfather clock, a wedding gift from Margaret's parents, ticked accusingly as Harold's throat tightened. His fingers traced their anniversary date engraved on the photo frame, a sob finally breaking free. Outside, the gardener's whistling carried through the open window, the sound now carrying a cruel new meaning. Harold Foster's weathered hands trembled as he held the unfamiliar bottle of lubricant found during his Sunday bathroom cleaning routine. Something wasn't right. He placed it carefully on his desk, the wood polished just yesterday as part of his weekend ritual. 35 years of marriage, and suddenly a foreign object in their most intimate space. The afternoon light filtered through his study windows, catching dust motes that danced above his organized shelves. Harold removed his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose, where pressure was building. The grandfather clock, Margaret's family heirloom, ticked accusingly in the corner, marking seconds of unwelcome realization. Margaret couldn't possibly, he whispered to the empty room, voice cracking on the last word. His gaze drifted to the shared tablet sitting on his desk, its notification light blinking. He hesitated, then picked it up, questioning his own actions, even as his principal's methodical mind took over. The password worked. She hadn't changed that one yet. But something made him check the deleted messages folder, a skill he'd learned helping students with technology troubles. The messages between Margaret and James were explicit enough that Harold read only fragments before his vision blurred. The garden renovation last spring, Margaret's unusual interest. It all clicked into terrible focus. Harold remembered his pride at her enthusiasm, how he'd told Emily that her mother had found a new hobby. The first tear tracked unnoticed down his weathered cheek until it splashed onto the screen. He wiped it away with his handkerchief. The monogrammed one their grandchildren had given him last Christmas. How could she with him? The thought came unbidden as Harold sank heavily into his leather chair, the one where he'd graded papers for decades before retirement. Family photos watched from the bookshelves. Their wedding. Emily's graduation. Family vacations. Moments now called into question. Was she already seeing him during their anniversary trip? Harold's shoulders slumped forward as quiet sobs began to break free. Outside, the faint sound of whistling carried through the window. James working in their garden while Harold's world collapsed indoors. His fingers traced the edge of their anniversary photo. Memories of celebration now tainted. The quiet sobs intensified as he struggled to reconcile the Margaret in those photos with the messages on the screen. The salt of his tears mixed with the lingering scent of lemon polish and coffee from his morning routine. A sudden recollection surfaced. Margaret's insistence on handling their online banking recently. Harold hadn't questioned it, trusting her as he always had. He reached for his phone, hands steadier now, as investigation began to replace shock. Several small transactions appeared, all below the notification threshold he'd set, each dated during his volunteer hours at the literacy center. The tears slowed as Harold's mind, the one that had managed school crises for 30 years, began to catalog facts and observations, password changes, schedule inconsistencies, financial discrepancies. His grief didn't disappear, but it made room for something else. Determination. The skills that had made him a respected principal would now serve a more personal purpose. The sound of a car in the driveway straightened his spine. Margaret was home. Harold quickly wiped his eyes, returned the bottle to its hiding place, and splashed cold water on his face. The man in the bathroom mirror looked older than he had this morning, but his jaw was set. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Harold straightened his tie, an automatic gesture from thousands of parent conferences, where composure mattered more than feelings. The sound of Margaret putting away groceries drifted from the kitchen so ordinary it made his discovery seem like a bad dream. But the tablet was back on his desk, the evidence undeniable. Act normal, he reminded himself, the principal's voice in his head steadier than his heartbeat. He made his way to the kitchen, cataloging details with new awareness. Margaret's phone lay face down beside the fruit bowl. The calendar on the wall showed her book club tonight, the third this month, when they'd only met monthly for years. "Need any help?" Harold asked, proud of how level his voice sounded despite the hollowness spreading in his chest. Margaret turned, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "I'm almost done. You could start the coffee if you'd like." He moved to the coffee pot, their 30th anniversary gift from Emily, and filled it methodically. His hands wanted to tremble, but he wouldn't let them. "Not yet. Not here." Margaret hummed softly, a tune he didn't recognize, but had heard James whistle in the garden last week. "How was your sister's visit?" Harold asked casually, watching her reflection in the kitchen window as he measured the grounds. The slight pause before she answered sent a cold confirmation through him. "Fine. Nothing special, just caught up on family gossip." Margaret tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, her tell when fabricating a story for unruly parents during school functions. He'd always found it endearing. Now it was evidence. "That's nice." He kept his back turned, afraid his eyes would betray him. "I'll be on the porch for a bit before dinner." Outside, the porch swing creaked rhythmically as Harold checked their shared calendar on his phone. Margaret's supposed lunch with her sister overlapped with a 2-hour gap where her car wasn't in the driveway. He'd noticed because he'd come home early from the literacy center with a headache, finding the house empty, despite her staying home to read that day. The garden James had renovated stretched before him, honeysuckle scent from the vine they'd planted on their 25th anniversary, now cloying rather than sweet. Harold pulled up their credit card statement, the screen blurring briefly before he blinked away the moisture. A charge at Riverside Cafe near James's apartment on the day Margaret claimed to be shopping with Emily. His coffee grew cold beside him, bitter like the truth it accompanied. The financial section of his mind, the one that had managed school budgets for decades, noted several small withdrawals from their joint account, all below the $500 notification threshold he'd set for their retirement savings. The pattern was too consistent for coincidence. Harold's finger traced the suspicious dates on his phone screen. A tear splashed onto the glass, hastily wiped away with his thumb, leaving a smear across the evidence of calculated deception. His chest tightened with a pain sharper than the heart scare 2 years ago, 35 years, 3.5 decades. The weight of it pressed against his ribs. The porch railing creaked under his tightening grip, knuckles widening, then relaxing as he forced himself to breathe. The principal, who had handled school crises, budget cuts, and troubled teens, would handle this, too, methodically, strategically. The garden tools leaned against the shed where James had last worked. Tomorrow was his scheduled day to return. Harold watched the sunset paint their yard golden, shadows lengthening like the suspicions he could no longer dismiss. His reflection in the window showed a man he barely recognized, older, wounded, but eyes hardening with resolve. A text notification broke his trance. Emily asking if they were still on for lunch next week. His finger hovered over the screen, considering whether to confide in his daughter when Margaret called him for dinner. He pocketed the phone, straightened his shoulders, and turned toward the door. The answers he needed wouldn't come from confrontation. Not yet. First, he needed irrefutable proof. The phone records displayed on Harold's laptop screen confirmed what his heart had already accepted. Hundreds of text messages and calls between Margaret and James, their frequency increasing over the past 6 months. The pattern was unmistakable, concentrated during Harold's volunteer shifts at the Literacy Center on Tuesdays and Thursdays. His dedication to helping adults learn to read had provided perfect cover for their deception. Harold closed the laptop with a gentle click that belied the storm inside him. Morning sunlight streamed through his study window, mockingly cheerful against his grim purpose. He checked his watch. 9:30 a.m. Margaret had left for what she called community garden volunteering, an activity she'd grown passionate about recently. 20 minutes later, Harold parked his sedan a discreet distance from the community garden project downtown. He sat watching the entrance for nearly an hour, observing gardeners coming and going, none of them Margaret. Mrs. Peterson, who coordinated the project and had taught with Harold years ago, noticed him and approached his car. "Harold, what brings you here?" she asked, leaning into his open window. "Looking for Margaret," he replied, managing a smile that felt like cracked glass. "Thought I'd surprise her for lunch." Mrs. Peterson's brow furrowed slightly. Margaret, I haven't seen her volunteer in weeks. I thought she'd gotten busy with other things. The confirmation settled in Harold's stomach like lead. He thanked Mrs. Peterson and pulled away, his destination already programmed into his GPS. The Wilsons' residence, where James was installing a greenhouse. Information gleaned from the landscaping company's public schedule that Harold had checked online this morning. He parked down the street, the familiar weight of his bird-watching binoculars in his hands, bringing an absurd normalcy to this surveillance. The Wilsons' property was expansive, their new greenhouse visible from the side street. Harold didn't have to wait long. Margaret appeared, walking toward the greenhouse where James worked. Even from this distance, Harold could see the transformation in her. Lighter steps, animated gestures, a vibrancy he hadn't seen directed at him in years. James emerged, pulling her into an embrace far beyond professional boundaries. Harold's hands trembled so badly he nearly dropped the binoculars when Margaret laughed. A higher, younger-sounding laugh than he'd heard from her in decades. With methodical precision that belied his churning emotions, Harold raised his phone and took several photos. The tears blurring his vision made it difficult, but his hands steadied with each shot. Evidence, documentation, the principal's approach to an unfolding crisis. Through the lens, he watched James pass Margaret a small envelope that she quickly tucked into her purse. Something financial perhaps, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Harold couldn't bear to watch more. He drove to Lake Serenity, where 37 years ago he had proposed to Margaret on a small wooden dock. The rain that had threatened all morning began as he parked, droplets streaking his windshield like the tears he'd been holding back. In the privacy of his car, overlooking the water where their future together had begun, Harold finally allowed himself to break. The first sob came from somewhere deep and primal, his hand clapping over his mouth too late to contain the sound. His shoulders shook with a grief he hadn't experienced since his father's death, tears flowing unchecked as rain pounded the car roof in sympathetic rhythm. Minutes or hours passed. Harold couldn't tell. Eventually, the storm inside him quieted enough for thought to return. He stared at his reflection in the rearview mirror at re-aimed eyes and a face transformed by pain. Then he did what he had taught countless teachers and administrators to do in crisis. He breathed deep, measured breaths that his counselor had shown him after his heart scare. The wedding ring felt suddenly heavy on his finger. The gold band that had represented unbreakable promises, now a symbol of broken trust. Harold wiped his eyes with his handkerchief and started the car. A missed call notification from Emily glowed on his phone, but he couldn't talk to her yet. Not until he decided how to proceed. The rain eased as clarity emerged. He wouldn't confront Margaret emotionally, wouldn't give in to the rage simmering beneath his grief. Instead, he would gather evidence, document patterns, and approach this betrayal as he had approached every challenge in his career with thorough preparation and strategic thinking. The tears had cleansed him, but it was his lifetime of experience that would guide him forward. Harold moved through his evening routine with practiced normally, asking Margaret about her day with just the right amount of interest to avoid suspicion. She spoke of community projects and book selections, lies flowing so naturally that he wondered how long deception had been her default. They ate dinner at the same table where they'd shared over 12,000 meals together, now separated by more than just the polished wood between them. Early night for me, he said after helping with dishes. Budget committee documents to review for the retirement community. Margaret seemed relieved at his announcement. I might read in bed. Don't worry about being quiet when you come up. Harold nodded, knowing her reading in bed would likely involve messaging James. He retreated to his study, waiting and watching the clock. At 8:15, he heard Margaret's shower running. At 8:30, her bedroom door closed. At 9:45, the faint sound of her distinctive laugh drifted down the hallway. A phone conversation undoubtedly. At 10:30, her light went out. Harold waited 30 more minutes before beginning his methodical search. He started with her closet, the one place she'd become territorial about in recent months. Behind winter sweaters in a shoe box labeled Old Tax Records, he found it a burner phone, unlike the iPhone they shared on their family plan. His principal's hands, which had confiscated countless phones from students, now held his wife's secret communication device. The messages confirmed his worst fears, explicit conversations, meeting arrangements, photographs he could barely glance at before his stomach turned. But Harold forced himself to document everything, his hands shaking so badly at first that he had to sit on a storage trunk to steady himself. Deep breaths. Focus on the task, not the emotion. The advice he'd given hundreds of teachers now applied to his own crisis. Moving to her home office, Harold discovered a hidden folder in her filing cabinet. Financial records revealed small, but regular transfers to an account he didn't recognize. $500 here, $400 there, amounts just below the notification threshold he'd set for their retirement accounts. He calculated quickly nearly $15,000 over 8 months. Their retirement savings meant for travel and grandchildren's education diverted to what purpose? Inside the folder, he found gift receipts for items he'd never received. A watch, golf clubs, clothing, all dated for birthdays and Christmases past. The affair timeline extended further than he'd suspected, potentially predating James' employment. A vacation photo album held the final confirmation. James appearing in the background of a community event picture from last year's mountain trip before the garden renovation had even begun. 35 years, Harold whispered, comparing their anniversary card, Margaret's flowing declaration of eternal love with a message sent to James the same day, describing Harold as predictable and clueless. The paper trembled slightly in his steady hands, rage and grief battling for dominance. His fist came down once on the desk, a rare physical expression of emotion quickly contained by a deliberate, deep breath. The principal's self-control reasserted itself despite tears tracking silently down his face. He could not afford emotional indulgence now. This required strategy. Harold photographed everything methodically, creating a case file reminiscent of the disciplinary procedures he'd developed as an administrator. Timeline, financial impact, communication patterns, evidence of premeditation, his professional thoroughness applied to the most personal betrayal imaginable. At his desk, Harold calculated the financial damages with precise taps on his calculator. Each number increased the tension in his jaw. His lips pressed into a bloodless line as he quantified betrayal's literal cost. Retirement funds gifts purchased but redirected. Restaurant meals charged to their joint account. The adding machine tape grew longer. A paper trail of deception. He worked until 3 a.m. securing copies of all evidence in a locked briefcase he'd use tomorrow to establish a safe deposit box only he could access. The banker who'd handled their accounts for 20 years would help him, without questions, another advantage of a lifetime building community relationships. As he finally prepared for bed, Harold paused at the guest room door rather than returning to their shared bedroom. He couldn't lie beside her tonight, maintaining the charade while evidence of her betrayal filled his briefcase. The guest bed's unfamiliar contours matched his new reality, uncomfortable but necessary. Lying in darkness, Harold's mind shifted from documentation to strategy. He would need legal counsel, but discreetly. David Lawson, his attorney friend since college, would understand the need for privacy. The financial aspects required immediate attention to prevent further drainage of their accounts. The ceiling fan rotated above him, its gentle rhythm eventually lulling him towards sleep despite the chaos of his thoughts. Tomorrow would begin the next phase, protection and preparation. His last conscious thought was a realization that Margaret and James had specifically coordinated their meetings around his volunteer schedule at the Literacy Center. They had weaponized his goodwill, exploited his community service to facilitate their betrayal. The calculated nature of their deception would make his response similarly methodical. Harold chose the Garden Cafe for lunch with Emily, her favorite childhood restaurant, where they'd celebrated her academic achievements and life milestones. The familiar booth by the window held memories of college acceptance celebrations and pre-wedding brunches, a history of family connection he hoped would create the right atmosphere for a difficult conversation. Emily arrived 10 minutes late, rushing in with the energy that had characterized her since childhood. At 40, she had Margaret's smile and Harold's analytical mind, a combination that had propelled her through law school and into a successful corporate career. "Sorry, Dad. Client call ran long." She hugged him tightly before sliding into the booth. "You look tired. Everything okay?" Harold had rehearsed this conversation all morning, applying the same careful preparation he'd used for difficult parent conferences during his career. "I wanted to talk to you about your mother," he began, keeping his voice gentle but direct. I've noticed some concerning changes in her behavior recently. Emily's expression shifted subtly, a guardedness replacing her initial warmth. What kind of changes? Inconsistencies in her schedule, unexplained absences, unusual spending patterns. Harold chose his words carefully, presenting observations without accusations, just as he taught his administrative staff. I thought perhaps you might have noticed something, or she might have confided in you. Emily's posture changed immediately, arms crossing, chin lifting slightly, defensive body language he recognized from her teenage years. Mom mentioned, "You've been acting paranoid lately, checking her phone, questioning her whereabouts." The statement struck Harold like a physical blow. Margaret had anticipated this conversation, had already shaped Emily's perception. "I've been concerned, not paranoid," he clarified, fighting to keep his tone even. "There are concrete reasons for my concerns." "Like what, Dad?" "Mom spends time on her hobbies, and suddenly you're suspicious. She's allowed to have her own life." Harold hesitated before reaching into his jacket pocket for the single piece of evidence he'd brought, a printed calendar showing Margaret's contradictory schedules. "Look at these dates, Emily. She told me she was with you shopping on the 15th, but her credit card shows charges at Riverside Cafe near James's apartment." Emily barely glanced at the paper. "So she changed plans and forgot to tell you, or maybe wanted lunch before shopping. You're invading her privacy over this." Her voice had taken on the professional edge she used in corporate negotiations. Mom said, "You've been controlling since retirement, having trouble adjusting to not being in charge anymore." Harold felt a chill spread through him. Margaret hadn't just prepared for this conversation. She'd constructed an entire narrative painting him as the villain. "Emily, I've never been controlling. You know that." "Do I?" "Because Mom says you've been tracking her movements, checking her phone, questioning her friends. That sounds pretty controlling to me." Emily's eyes flashed with the same righteous indignation he'd seen when she defended classmates against injustice, except now it was directed at him. "She's worried about you, Dad. We both are." Harold's hand extended across the table, instinctively reaching for the connection they'd always shared. "Emily, please listen." She pulled back, leaving his hand outstretched and empty. "I think you need to talk to someone professional. This kind of jealousy and suspicion isn't healthy." The rejection hit harder than any physical pain Harold had experienced, including his heart scare 2 years ago. His daughter, the person whose critical thinking he'd nurtured since childhood, had accepted Margaret's manipulation without question. The napkin in his lap was twisted beyond recognition in his clenched fist beneath the table. "I'm sorry you feel that way," he managed finally, his voice steady despite the earthquake inside. "I hope you'll keep an open mind about what's really happening." Emily softened slightly at his obvious hurt. "Look, I have to get back to the office, but please think about what I said. Maybe see Dr. Michaels again for all our sakes." The lunch ended awkwardly, Emily's quick hug feeling perfunctory rather than loving. Harold watched her walk to her car, remembering how he taught her to ride a bicycle in the park across the street. Her determination even after skinned knees and failed attempts. That determination now worked against him, her loyalty to Margaret unquestioning. He drove home in a daze, the rejection creating a hollowness that expanded with each mile. When he arrived, the subtle signs of intrusion were immediately apparent to his principal's observant eye. Desk drawers slightly misaligned, papers minutely rearranged. With growing dread, Harold checked his evidence folder empty. While he'd been meeting with Emily, Margaret had searched his office and removed all evidence copies he'd kept at home. The coordination was obvious. Emily's lunch diversion, while Margaret secured the evidence. His own daughter had unknowingly participated in undermining him. The weight of this realization was too much to bear at home. Harold drove to Lakeside Park, where he'd once pushed Emily on the swings, taught her to throw a baseball, celebrated family picnics. The autumn afternoon matched his mood, leaves falling around him like hopes as he sat heavily on a bench dedicated to lifelong love. For the first time in public, Harold's control shattered completely. Tears flowed unchecked down his weathered face, shoulders shaking with silent sobs as he confronted his total isolation. A park maintenance worker glanced at him with concern before looking away in embarrassment, unwilling to intrude on an elderly man's private grief. Cold rain began to fall, but Harold barely noticed. The family he'd built his life around had aligned against him. His reputation for rational judgment meant nothing against Margaret's manipulative narrative. The retired principal, once respected for his wisdom and fairness, now dismissed as paranoid and controlling. Through tear-blurred vision, Harold watched children playing on distant swings, their laughter carrying across the park, life continuing while his world collapsed. The rain soaked through his jacket, mingling with tears he no longer attempted to hide. His phone vibrated in his pocket. Harold ignored it at first, then finally checked the screen through force of habit. An unknown number with a text message. I've seen them too. Not the first time he's done this. Call me if you want to talk. Harold stared at the message, a lifeline appearing at his moment of deepest despair. Through the rain and tears, the faintest spark of hope flickered to life. Has betrayal left you standing completely alone, with even family believing the lies against you? Share your pain below, like if Harold's silent tears in the rain mirror your own experience. Follow now to discover who finally believes his truth. Harold stared at the text message for 3 days before responding. Experience had taught him to approach unexpected communications with caution, especially during crisis. The message could be a trap, another manipulation from Margaret or James to document paranoid behavior. But desperation eventually overcame weariness. "Who is this?" he texted back, keeping his response non-committal. The reply came within minutes. "Linda Ramirez from Oak Lane. My sister Caroline worked at West Ridge Gardens where James was landscaper before your neighborhood. Can we meet? Prefer not to discuss by text." Harold suggested downtown coffee shop, neutral territory far from his usual haunts where he wouldn't encounter acquaintances. He arrived 20 minutes early, selecting a corner booth with a view of both entrances. Principal's vigilance now serving personal security. Linda Ramirez was younger than he expected, perhaps 50, with alert eyes that assessed him as thoroughly as he evaluated her. She slid into the booth without ordering. "Thank you for meeting me," she began without preamble. "I recognized the pattern when I visited your daughter's house last month. James was there discussing garden plans with your wife. The way they interacted." She shook her head. "I've seen it before with my sister." Harold's hands trembled slightly around his ceramic mug. "What happened with your sister?" Caroline was 63, recently widowed with a good insurance settlement. James did landscaping for her neighbor, then offered to help with her overgrown garden. Linda's voice hardened. Within 6 months, he'd convinced her to invest in his business expansion. She lost nearly $30,000 before discovering he was involved with another client. Harold listened intently, professional training helping him separate emotion from information. "You have evidence of this?" Linda nodded, glancing around before sliding an envelope across the table. "My sister was too embarrassed to pursue legal action, but I documented everything. When I saw the same pattern, beginning with your wife, I visited Emily under the pretense of discussing community projects. I managed to photograph some papers Margaret left in your daughter's guest room during their planning session." Harold carefully examined the contents. Copies of recent bank statements showing withdrawals, a handwritten list of account numbers in Margaret's distinctive script, and photos of James with an older woman who wasn't Caroline or Margaret. "There are others," Linda confirmed, seeing his focus on the photographs. "It's a pattern. He targets older women, especially those with assets or retirement accounts. Your wife may not be his only current project." For the first time since discovering the betrayal, Harold felt something beyond pain and isolation, a sense of clarity and purpose. This wasn't just a personal betrayal. It was a predatory pattern that had hurt others and would continue without intervention. "Why did you reach out to me?" Harold asked, his principal's instinct for motivation still sharp. Linda's professional demeanor cracked slightly. "Because my sister didn't have someone like you, smart enough to gather evidence before confronting, methodical enough to build a case." She was humiliated, then disbelieved. Her eyes held genuine emotion. No one should face that alone. Harold felt the first hopeful tears since his discovery, quickly wiped away as he straightened his posture. "Thank you," he said simply, the words insufficient for the validation she'd provided. That afternoon, Harold met David Lawson at their fishing dock, a weekly tradition maintained for 30 years, regardless of weather or circumstances. The tackle box remained untouched between them as Harold outlined the situation. Legal pad replacing fishing gear. David listened without interruption, his attorney's mind cataloging relevant points, while his friend's heart recognized the pain beneath Harold's measured words. When Harold's voice finally broke, describing Emily's rejection, David's handshake transformed into a supportive embrace. Rare physical comfort between men of their generation that spoke volumes about their friendship. "First, we secure your finances," David said. "Professional efficiency taking over. Second, we document everything with proper chain of custody for potential legal action. Third, we prepare for confrontation with maximum impact and minimum legal vulnerability." Harold nodded, tears falling but wiped away decisively between strategic points. Purpose had replaced despair. Methodology overcoming emotional paralysis. "Margaret has Emily convinced I'm controlling and paranoid." Harold said, the pain still evident despite his composed exterior. "For now," David replied, "evidence changes perceptions. We'll ensure Emily witnesses the truth directly." By evening, Harold had assembled a support network beyond David and Linda. Judith Myers, his former school secretary, confirmed witnessing similar behavior from James with school board member Ella Laner Winters 2 years earlier. The current principal offered Harold use of the school's secure office for evidence compilation away from Margaret's intrusions. Standing in his former office, surrounded by awards still displaying his name, Harold felt something shift inside him. The wall of recognition from his educational career reminded him of his capacity for leadership during crisis. His reflection showed squared shoulders and lifted chin, a glimpse of the respected administrator he'd been and still was. Harold methodically photographed all new evidence copies, hands steady now with purpose rather than trembling with shock. The financial protections David had helped implement that afternoon would prevent further drainage of their accounts. The evidence Linda provided established a pattern beyond his individual case. For the first time since discovering Margaret's betrayal, Harold allowed himself to acknowledge not just what he had lost, but what remained. Professional respect, methodical mind, support network, and the capacity to protect others from similar predation. The tears that occasionally fell while working were no longer those of despair, but of determination and resolved purpose. When he returned home that evening, Harold maintained the careful facade of normalcy with Margaret, but inside transformation had occurred. The grief-stricken husband had not disappeared, but he now worked alongside the strategic principal, the respected community leader, and the protective elder determined to expose exploitation. The path forward would require all his accumulated wisdom. But for the first time, Harold felt equal to the challenge. As he organized the final evidence file in his briefcase, he allowed himself a moment of quiet validation. Decades of professional crisis management had prepared him for this most personal battle. The confrontation would come, but on his terms, with his full capabilities engaged. Margaret's manipulation had nearly succeeded in isolating him completely. Instead, it had revealed a community of support he hadn't realized existed and reawakened strengths he'd forgotten he possessed. Harold transformed his study into a strategic command center, applying the same meticulous preparation he'd used before critical school board meetings or difficult expulsion hearings. Evidence arranged in chronological order covered his desk. Financial records first, followed by communication logs, photographic evidence, and finally testimonials from Linda's sister and others affected by James's predatory pattern. His principal's instinct for staging guided every detail. Margaret would sit facing the family photos, a psychological reminder of what she had betrayed. The desk lamp would illuminate the evidence, while keeping Harold's face partially shadowed, providing emotional advantage during the confrontation. Each document was precisely positioned for maximum impact when revealed. "You deserve the truth, and so do I," Harold practiced to his mirror reflection, voice steady despite the tear that traced down his cheek. He wiped it away with determination, straightening his tie with the precise gesture that had preceded thousands of difficult conversations throughout his career. David had helped him secure their finances yesterday. Retirement accounts now required dual authentication, credit cards temporarily frozen for suspicious activity, and a separate account established for Harold's immediate needs. The financial shield was in place before Margaret could realize her access was restricted. The most difficult preparation had been contacting Emily. Harold had sent a simple text. "Need you to come by the house tomorrow evening around 7. Important family matter." Her reply showed lingering skepticism, but agreement to attend. Harold hadn't explained further, knowing Margaret would be alerted if Emily knew too much. The timing was deliberate. Emily would arrive mid-confrontation, witnessing her mother's reactions rather than hearing Harold's accusations. Harold checked his watch. 5:30 p.m. Margaret would return from her gardening committee meeting by 6 o'clock. Time for final preparations. He placed the most damning evidence at the center of his display. Financial records showing nearly $15,000 transferred from their retirement accounts to James, matching the pattern documented in Linda's sister's case. The parallel was too precise for coincidence, too calculated for innocence. In the bathroom mirror, Harold studied his reflection one last time. The man, looking back, seemed older than he had weeks ago, but also somehow stronger. The initial shock and devastation had been replaced by resolved purpose. His hand briefly touched the wedding photo on the dresser before turning it face down, lingering on the frame edge momentarily. The symbolic action marked his transition from betrayed husband to truth seeker. Harold checked his phone for Linda's confirmation text. She and David were positioned nearby, ready to provide support if needed. Everything was in place, every contingency considered, every reaction anticipated. The grandfather clock chimed 6 as Margaret's car pulled into the driveway. Harold took a deep, centering breath, shoulders squaring with military precision as the front door opened. He tucked his handkerchief into his pocket with deliberate care. Stage set for the confrontation that would irrevocably change their lives. "Harold," Margaret called from the entryway. "I brought that wine you like from Thompson's, a peace offering, or just routine manipulation?" It didn't matter now. "In my study," he replied, voice calm and measured. "Could you join me for a moment?" He heard her keys drop in the ceramic dish by the door, footsteps approaching with unsuspecting normalcy. Harold made a final adjustment to the central financial document. Professional thoroughness evident even in this most personal crisis. The tears that had dominated recent weeks were replaced by resolute focus. Margaret appeared in the doorway, initially casual until she registered the unusual setup. Harold behind the desk, evidence arranged in neat rows, his posture formal rather than relaxed. "What's all this?" she asked, weariness replacing her smile. "Please sit down, Margaret." Harold gestured to the chair positioned to face both him and the family photos on the wall behind him. "We need to talk about James, the missing money, and the lies." Her expression flickered between confusion and alarm, the mask of normally slipping before she could reinforce it. In that unguarded moment, Harold saw the truth he needed. She knew exactly what this was about. As Margaret slowly took the seat, Harold felt an unexpected sense of calm. 35 years of marriage were about to be redefined not by her betrayal alone, but by his response to it. The confrontation would be difficult, painful even, but also necessary and ultimately liberating. The principles that had guided his professional life would serve him now. Truth over comfort, evidence over emotion, dignity over vengeance. Harold had spent a career helping young people face consequences with integrity. He would demand no less from the woman who had shared his life than betrayed his trust. Emily would arrive in approximately 30 minutes. By then, the initial denials would have given way to the evidence. His daughter would witness not an emotional husband lashing out with jealous accusations, but a methodical presentation of incontrovertible facts. "Before we begin," Harold said, voice steady with the authority that had commanded respect throughout his career, "I want you to know that I have secured our retirement accounts and contacted our attorney. This conversation is about truth, not reconciliation." Margaret's posture stiffened, her eyes darting to the evidence before her. The confrontation that would redefine their family was now unavoidable. When betrayal destroys everything you've built together, confronting the painful truth takes a courage few will ever understand. Comment if you've had to stand your ground like Harold, like this post. If you're silently cheering for justice, follow now to witness the moment decades of deception finally meet the unshakable dignity of a man who deserves better. I don't know what you think you found, but you're overreacting. Margaret's opening defense came with practiced confidence, her posture deliberately relaxed despite the tension evident in her shoulders. Harold responded not with words, but with evidence, sliding the first document across the desk, a calendar comparison showing her claimed whereabouts against proven locations. His hand moved with the steady precision that had characterized his professional presentations for decades. "These are the dates you said you were volunteering at the community garden," he stated calmly. "Mrs. Peterson confirms. You haven't been there in months." Margaret's eyes narrowed slightly, Jean's memory isn't what it used to be. I've been helping with administrative work, not the physical gardening. Harold nodded as if considering this, then presented phone records showing hundreds of texts and calls between Margaret and James, highlighted by date and time. These all occurred during my volunteer hours at the Literacy Center. An interesting coincidence. He's our landscaper, Harold. Of course, I communicate with him about the garden. Her voice held the same reasonable tone she'd used with difficult parents during school functions, a tone he now recognized as carefully constructed. The content of those communications goes well beyond landscaping, Harold replied, maintaining measured eye contact. I've seen the messages, Margaret. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face before she recovered. You check my phone. That's an invasion of privacy. Her voice rose with manufactured indignation. This is exactly the controlling behavior Emily's concerned about. Rather than defending himself, Harold presented the third piece of evidence. Bank statements showing regular transfers from their retirement account to an unknown account, each just below the notification threshold. $15,000. Margaret, where did it go? The shift in her strategy was immediate. You've always controlled our finances. I finally needed something of my own. Her chin lifted defensively. Is a wife not entitled to financial independence after 35 years? Financial independence doesn't require secrecy, Harold observed, voice remaining steady. Nor does it typically involve transferring funds to a landscaper's account. The doorbell interrupted whatever response Margaret had prepared. Harold checked his watch. 7:05 p.m. Emily had arrived precisely when needed. That's Emily, he said, rising to answer the door. I asked her to join us. Panic flashed across Margaret's face. This is between us, Harold. There's no need to involve our daughter in private matters. Harold paused at the doorway. The truth isn't something to hide from family, Margaret, especially when family has been used to reinforce deception. Emily stood on the porch, her professional composure faltering at Harold's formal demeanor. Dad, what's going on? Is Mom okay? Your mother is fine, he assured her, gesturing toward the study. We're having an important discussion. I believe you should witness. Emily followed hesitantly, her legal training evident in her cautious assessment of the unusual setup. Upon seeing Margaret's tense posture and the documents spread across the desk, she stopped abruptly in the doorway. What is this? She asked, looking between her parents. Your father is making wild accusations, Margaret began, voice trembling. He's been tracking my movements, checking my phone. Harold interrupted, not with words, but by sliding the next piece of evidence toward Emily. Photographs of Margaret and James in intimate moments at the Wilson property, followed by financial documentation of transfers matching dates from James's previous victims. These were taken last week when your mother claimed to be volunteering, Harold explained calmly. The financial records show a pattern identical to what happened with Caroline Ramirez before she lost $30,000 to James. Emily's shocked gasp echoed in the suddenly still room as she stared at the undeniable evidence. Mom. Margaret's defensive posture, arms crossed, chin raised, began to crumble as Emily examined document after document. Her shoulders slumped gradually as the weight of exposed deception settled visibly upon her. It's not what it looks like, Margaret attempted, but the protest sounded hollow even to her own ears. I trusted you with everything, Harold stated with quiet intensity, voice steady, despite the emotional weight behind his words. Our home, our family, our retirement. You didn't just betray me, Margaret. You conspired to portray me as unstable when I discovered the truth. Emily's eyes moved between her parents with dawning comprehension, the attorney's analytical mind processing evidence, while the daughter grappled with painful realizations. You told me Dad was being paranoid, she whispered to Margaret. You said he needed help. I was trying to protect you from this mess. Margaret responded, reaching for Emily's hand, which was quickly withdrawn. Harold presented the final evidence. Testimony from Linda Ramirez about James's pattern of targeting older women, particularly those with significant retirement savings or property assets. This isn't just about an affair, he explained to Emily. It's about a calculated financial predation that has affected multiple victims. Margaret's composure finally shattered completely. It wasn't supposed to go this far, she admitted, tears forming. James said he needed temporary help with his business. Then it became more, and I didn't know how to stop. How long? Harold asked. The question simple, but loaded with decades of implications. Since last year's community fundraiser, Margaret confessed, unable to meet his eyes before he even started our garden project. The admission confirmed Harold's timeline, while explaining James's appearance in background photos from events months earlier. A single tear of vindication tracked down Harold's cheek as reality was finally acknowledged publicly. He wiped it away with dignity rather than shame, strength evident even in vulnerability. Emily moved to stand beside her father, her legal mind now fully engaged. The financial transfers could constitute fraud, she noted, professional tone masking personal devastation, especially if there's a pattern of targeting other victims. Margaret seemed to physically shrink in her chair. James said it was just business loans, that he'd pay it back with interest once his company expanded. The same story he told Caroline Ramirez, Harold noted quietly, and Eleanor Winters before her. The grandfather clock chimed 8 times, marking not just the hour, but the end of deception. The family structure had visibly realigned in the study. Emily now standing with Harold. Margaret isolated by her own actions. Harold maintained his dignity throughout, never raising his voice or resorting to accusation beyond the evidence presented. His vindication came not through emotional outburst, but through methodical revelation of truth, the approach that had defined his professional life, now preserving his personal integrity. As Margaret finally acknowledged the full extent of her deception, Harold felt no triumph, only confirmation. The pain remained, but vindication had replaced uncertainty. Truth, however difficult, provided firmer ground than deception. Emily's hand rested briefly on her father's shoulder, a silent apology and reconnection that meant more than any verbal expression could convey. The family bonds damaged by Margaret's manipulation had begun their slow repair, even as the marriage that had anchored them faced its inevitable end. 6 months had transformed Harold's home. The dining room table extended to its full length, accommodated more guests than when Margaret had lived there. Afternoon sunlight streamed through windows no longer obscured by the heavy drapes she had preferred, illuminating walls where photos had been thoughtfully rearranged. Family connections that had remained true still displayed, while spaces once dominated by Margaret now held Emily's childhood artwork and Harold's educational achievements. "More wine, Dad?" Emily asked, moving around the table with a bottle of Cabernet. The ease between them had returned, their relationship strengthened rather than permanently damaged by the crisis that had forced them to redefine family. Harold nodded with a smile that now reached his eyes. "Just a little. I'm driving David and Judith home later." Around the table sat the support network that had emerged during his darkest moments. David Lawson, whose legal expertise had guided Harold through a divorce settlement that protected his retirement and home. Linda Ramirez, whose intervention had provided crucial validation. Judith Myers, his former secretary, whose organizational skills had helped him rebuild his daily life, and 2 other neighbors who had rallied around him when the truth became known. Conversation flowed naturally, touching occasionally on recent developments. Margaret had moved to Arizona following the divorce settlement, reportedly living with a cousin, while financial restitution payments to Harold further strained her resources. James faced legal trouble from multiple financial victims who had come forward after Harold and Linda's evidence became public, with formal charges pending in 2 counties. The prosecutor called yesterday. Emily mentioned as she passed the salad, "They may need your testimony for the case against James, but they're trying to build it without putting you through that." Harold appreciated the consideration, but had already made his peace with public involvement. "I'll testify if needed. Others should be protected from similar exploitation." After dinner, while his guests enjoyed coffee and dessert, Harold noticed his elderly neighbor, Frank Jenkins, watching from his porch across the street. The widower had become increasingly isolated since his wife's passing last year. "Excuse me a moment," Harold said, stepping outside into the spring evening. Frank looked embarrassed at being caught watching. "Sorry, Harold. Didn't mean to spy. Just reminded me of dinners Elaine used to host." "We have plenty of food," Harold offered. "Why don't you join us?" The older man hesitated. "Don't want to intrude on your family time." "Not intrusion. Inclusion," Harold corrected gently. "Besides, I've been meaning to ask your advice about retirement investment options. David mentioned you worked in finance before retiring." The strategic mention of Frank's expertise, making him valuable rather than burdensome, was purposeful, drawing from Harold's understanding of dignity's importance, especially to aging men. Frank straightened slightly, nodding with renewed purpose as he followed Harold inside. As Harold introduced Frank to the group, Emily caught her father's eye with an appreciative smile, recognizing what he'd done. His painful experience was already transforming into wisdom shared with others, the hallmark of resilience at its finest. Later, while guests chatted in the living room, Harold excused himself briefly to the back porch. The garden he had replanted himself flourished with new growth, no trace remaining of James's work. The metaphor wasn't lost on him as he gazed at stars emerging in the twilight sky. He twisted the empty spot on his finger where his wedding ring had left a slight indentation, a physical reminder of experience that was fading gradually, just as the emotional wound had begun to heal. A single peaceful tear acknowledged the journey as Harold reflected on the past 6 months. The divorce had proceeded with surprising efficiency, Margaret offering little resistance once confronted with comprehensive evidence. The financial recovery wasn't complete, but David's prompt action had prevented further losses. Most importantly, Harold's reputation had been restored as the truth emerged throughout their community. Emily approached quietly, joining him at the porch railing. "You okay out here alone?" "Not alone," Harold corrected, smiling gently. "Just reflecting." She hesitated before speaking again. "I'm still sorry I didn't believe you initially. I should have known better. She was your mother. Trust was natural." Harold had forgiven Emily weeks ago, understanding the impossible position Margaret had created for their daughter. What matters is that you were open to the truth when presented with evidence. Their relationship had emerged stronger with Emily calling more frequently and bringing her children for weekend visits. The grandchildren now had a bedroom permanently designated in Harold's home, their toys and books signs of continuing family despite the fracture in its foundation. Inside, laughter erupted from the dining room. Harold and Emily exchanged smiles before rejoining their guests, the warm glow of companionship replacing isolation that had once seemed insurmountable. As Harold carved a second dessert at Frank's request, he noticed his hands were completely steady. The trembling that had characterized his early discovery had disappeared, replaced by the confident movements of a man who had rediscovered his worth beyond the betrayal that might have defined him. The evening concluded with plans for next month's gathering already taking shape. David's retirement celebration would be hosted here, continuing the transformation of Harold's home from site of betrayal to center of community connection. After driving the last guests home, Harold returned to a house that finally felt truly his. He adjusted a new family photo on the wall, a recent gathering without Margaret, with a satisfied nod at its composition. The image showed a smaller but authentic circle bound by chosen loyalty rather than obligatory connection. That night, as Harold prepared for bed in what had once been the guest room, but was now unquestionably his, the phone rang. The caller ID showed the community center where he had begun volunteering again. "Harold, it's Richard from the board. Sorry to call so late, but we've been discussing that support group idea you mentioned for people recovering from betrayal and financial exploitation. Several members have experienced similar situations, and we think your perspective would be invaluable as a group facilitator. Would you consider leading it?" The request represented everything Harold's journey had become. Personal pain transformed into community resource. Isolation replaced by meaningful connection. Victimhood overcome by leadership. His experience rather than defining him as betrayed now qualified him as guide for others navigating similar terrain. "I'd be honored," Harold responded, genuine purpose evident in his voice. As he settled into bed, Harold felt a sense of completion that had seemed impossible 6 months earlier. The marriage that had anchored his life for 35 years was gone, but the wisdom gained through its painful ending had created unexpected new beginnings. The tears that occasionally still came were no longer those of devastation, but of quiet acknowledgement of a journey completed and lessons hard-earned. The grandfather clock, now relocated to his study rather than the hallway Margaret had preferred, chimed 11. Harold listened to its familiar cadence with new appreciation. Like that family heirloom, he had weathered significant change without losing essential function or purpose. If anything, both had found more suitable placements, their value undiminished by circumstance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities. Harold would face them with the same dignity and methodical approach that had guided him through the darkest period of his life. The betrayal that might have destroyed him had instead revealed strengths he hadn't fully recognized: resilience, community connection, and the capacity to begin again, even at 65. The final thought before sleep claimed him was not of Margaret or the pain she had caused, but of the meaningful life he was creating beyond betrayal. It was, Harold reflected, the most profound victory possible, not just surviving, but truly living again. Folks, you've been there, haven't you? That moment when everything you believed about your life suddenly shifts beneath your feet like sand. Perhaps it wasn't a lubricant bottle or explicit messages that shattered your world, but we all recognize that sick feeling when trust cracks open. The way Harold's hands trembled as decades of certainty unraveled. That's a pain that doesn't need explaining to those of us who've lived long enough to know what matters. Truth is, betrayal at our age cuts deeper. We've weathered job losses, empty nests, health scares. But when someone who's witnessed your hair turning gray decides you're no longer enough, that stings something fierce. It's not just the hurt of the moment. It's the questioning of every memory, every sacrifice, every compromise made in the name of partnership. Were you ever truly seen or merely tolerated? When family sides against you, when you sit alone on a rain-soaked bench with tears mixing with raindrops, it's easy to believe the story ends there. But remember how Harold found his strength, not in spite of his age, but because of it. Those same methodical skills that made him an effective principal became his armor. The wisdom you've earned through decades of living isn't weakness. It's your most powerful tool when the world tilts sideways. Your chair might see a little louder these days. Your reflections show more lines than you'd like. But don't you dare believe that makes you easier to discard. The support Harold found didn't appear by accident. It came from the community connections and respect he'd built over a lifetime. Those same connections exist around you, even when isolation makes them hard to see. When the dust settles and you stand in your kitchen that feels too quiet, know that rebuilding isn't just possible. It's your birthright. The garden Harold replanted symbolizes what we all can do after devastation. Choose new growth on our own terms. The evening dinner with chosen family rather than obligated relations shows us another way forward. You ain't finished yet, darling. Not by a long shot. There's dignity in starting over at 65 or 75 or 85, perhaps even more than in younger years, because we do it with eyes wide open. We rebuild with intention rather than naivety. So tonight, maybe shed one last tear for what was lost, then look to the stars like Harold did. They've witnessed countless human heartbreaks and still shine.